Give it a few more, 30 more seconds, let's say, for people to start rolling in. But welcome to everyone who's already joined. Good to see everyone. Okie doke. We've got a lot to fit into today, so I think as I'm sort of introducing the session, people that can start to roll in. So welcome everybody to the latest Circular Economy Hub lunchtime webinar. This one is focusing on accelerating adoption of a circular economy in the UK hospitality sector. I'm Ryan Nolan. I'm a research fellow in the Hub, and which is co-directed by Professors Fiona Charnley and Peter Hopkinson, who are both on the call today. For those of you who don't know, the CE Hub is part of the NICER programme. That's the National Interdisciplinary Circular Economy Research Programme, which was a 4-year project funded by UKRI and DEFRA, who, with the aim of accelerating and scaling the UK's transition to a circular economy. Just go through some housekeeping before we jump into the session. So please keep your microphones on mute while the speakers are presenting. The event is being recorded already, so please keep your cameras off if you don't want to be in the recording. And if you, so the content of this workshop will be used for the purpose of academic research into systems thinking and sustainability transitions. When we get to the Q&A, if you wouldn't like to be on the recording, feel free to pop your questions in the chat and I'll read those out when we get to that point. So next slide, please, Alex. So this is a slightly special version of the Circular Economy Hub lunchtime webinars. It's the second where we're launching one of our CEctor reports. And CEctor is a kind of a sub-project of the CE Hub, where we're focusing on 5 different sectors that we think have been slightly underrepresented or less addressed in the circular economy research space. The first one was on the medical technology, so in healthcare, and we launched the reports and had a webinar for that one not so long ago. Today is hospitality, of course. We have electronics, renewables and solar PV. I'll say a little bit more about that one at the end of the webinar today, and finance as a CE enabler, all of which will be releasing reports and having accompanying webinars like this one. This today is being led by Danny Farrow from the Circular Economy Hub, and without further ado, I'll pass over to her. Thanks, Danny.
Thanks, Ryan. Hello, everybody. I'm Danny. I've been working on this Accelerating Circular Economy in the Hospitality Sector project over the last year. And I'm delighted to be able to share with you some of the findings from the project. It is a bit of a whistle-stop tour, so I would encourage you to have a look into the report as well, especially if there's anything that comes up today that's of particular interest to you. And before I begin, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to all of you who got involved with the process, who came along to our workshops, who gave up your time to speak to me in formal interviews or just general chats about what the hospitality sector was like and what you're going through. So thank you. And without further ado, let's have a look at what we found on the project. So to start with, the hospitality sector, it encompasses a wide range of food and accommodation businesses, right from single-site B&Bs through to big multi-chain hotels, restaurants, fast food chains and breweries. So it's a hugely varied sector. It turns over 100,000 billion annually, and in terms of employment, it's the 6th largest sector in the UK. So it's clearly an important sector economically. It's also an important sector socially because it provides spaces where communities can gather, and its outreach includes people from across many cultures through the tourism industry. So the circular economy for this is not a new concept for this sector, but work so far in this space has tended to focus on 2 key waste streams, so food waste and reducing plastic packaging. So these are 2 really important places to intervene in the system. But by zooming out, as you can see that we've done in this image on the slide, there's a much wider range of materials and products which flow into the sector through construction activities, through refurbishments, back of house equipment, and all of this greatly increases the potential of a circular economy if we apply it more widely across the organisation and its activities. So although food and waste are very, very important, there's a lot of work already in this space through great organisations such as WRAP and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So we do touch on those waste streams in the report, but the majority of the project is focused on some of these other material flows, which have received less attention from a circular economy perspective. So we hope that this more holistic focus will lead to circular economy being applied more widely across the hospitality sector. So what are some of the challenges that are facing the hospitality sector? We can see that at the moment it's a system under great stress. We tend to look at this through a value chain approach. So we look at the inflow of the products and the materials that come into the sector, followed by their use phase. So what happens to them when they're actually in use, how long do they last, and then the outflow stage. So you can see that there's challenges coming up across each of these stages, and those challenges are impacting on sector operations. Alongside that, on top of that, we've got a feedback loop. So we can see that the sector's environmental impact in terms of emissions and carbon footprint is contributing to human-induced climate change. And that in turn is increasing some of the challenges faced by the sector. So cost of materials, availability of resources, and the viability of travel and tourism in the long term. So what's the solution to some of these challenges? We see the solution as the circular economy. So when we're talking about the circular economy on this project, we're talking about the 3 pillars set out by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So those are designing out waste, recirculating materials at their highest value for the longest possible time, regeneration of nature, and all of that within a system that's powered by renewable energy. A key point to make here is that those inner loops, so you can see reuse, reprocess, refurbishment, are the most effective for retaining value within the system. So recycling should be considered as the loop of last resort because it's often very resource intensive and it can degrade the value of the material. What's important to note here for the hospitality sector is that things like reuse and reprocessing and refurbished items can also reduce costs for the sector, as well as reducing the material inflows. And finally, what this image shows us is that the circular economy represents a very complex, dynamic system. And so we need to take a systems approach to change. And this might mean combining different interventions for maximum impact. So in terms of circular economy adoption, is it already happening in the sector? I'm pleased to say yes, it definitely is, including for resources beyond food and plastics. So it's happening across a wide range of materials and activities. And I think it's important to note that it's happening within the current regulatory and policy frameworks. So even though we had some challenges arise throughout the project related to specific policies, even within the current framework, there's lots that can take place. So the case studies that we looked at were often led by innovative thinkers within the hospitality sector and enabled by third parties. So we saw cases where charities or startups, trade bodies were involved in enabling the circular economy for hospitality. And projects like this rely on very strong collaborative relationships. And I've just come back from the Circular Economy Hotspot in Wales, and I think the key message that was shared at that event was the importance of partnerships and collaboration in the circular economy. So no one organisation can do this alone. And so changing the way that we work to develop these strong partnerships is really important. In cases where circular economy principles were embedded in the redesign of spaces, we saw environmental benefits combined with social benefits. So that was for employees, we saw benefits for local communities, and we saw people really using that redesign of the system as a catalyst to think about other problems within the system and other spaces where we could improve people's well-being. Digital systems have got the potential to reduce the distance between manufacturers and end users, which allow for the design of products which really meet the needs of users. And this was a challenge that we saw come up in hospitality between designers and manufacturers of catering equipment and the actual end users of catering equipment, and there being a bit of a gap there between the way that the equipment was designed to be used and the way that it actually was used. And so reducing some of those gaps and sharing information can really support the use of products and the design of products to meet users' needs. And also the collection of data on actual product lifespan and repair. And we've got Impact Loop coming to speak to us a little bit further on, so I'm sure we'll hear more about that then. And then finally, in terms of infrastructure, this was a really important reality for the hospitality sector. So in terms of access to infrastructure, we saw some challenges, and it was third parties again that were coming in and really enabling organisations to capture the value of materials. So where they perhaps didn't have the space to retain products, they were looking to other people who perhaps held on to them whilst they found alternative uses. So for the reuse of materials, that became really important. So circular economy principles are being applied across the sector, but to what extent is this happening and what does that look like? So to have a look at this, one of our workshop activities brought together stakeholders from across the sector, from supply chains and policymakers as well. And we brought people together to think about what was important to them in terms of the redesign of the system. So we've got our circular economy principles at the top there, but there are other measures of success that are important to those people, to those stakeholders. So we came up with 11 criteria that are important to the sector, and you can see those there. And we scored them. So from 0, where it's not being done at all, through to 10, where it's the best possible scenario. You can see the scores of the current system for hospitality there. And so what we saw there was that it wasn't a particularly encouraging picture. And when we look at those 3 founding principles of a circular economy, the elimination of waste and pollution scored most highly out of those 3 at 4.6 out of 10, followed by circulation of materials, which scored 3.8, and regeneration of nature actually received the lowest score out of all of the measures at just 3.2 out of 10. So what we take away from this is that although circular economy principles are being implemented, adoption is still very much in its infancy, with organisations tending to lead the way in the transition, being exceptions rather than the norm. So what are the challenges to circular economy adoption? Through our workshops, we identified 6 key challenge areas, and these span social, cultural, behaviour change and technical aspects of the system. And all of these need to be understood and addressed for an effective circular economy transition to take place, because they're all interrelated. So you make a change in one place, you need to understand its implications elsewhere in the system. And I'll just whiz you through these quite quickly. So we found that there was no clear goal or vision for achieving a circular economy. There was mixed messaging about what a circular economy was, some confusion over how it related to other strategies like net zero and carbon accounting. Overall knowledge of the circular economy was perceived to be quite low in the sector. Many businesses are struggling to get by. They've got no time to invest in understanding how circular economy strategies might support them in the long term with business resilience and long-term viability. We also saw that access to skills in circular economy principles like repair and refurbishment was in some places limited or difficult to access. We saw there was an absence of policies and funding to support circular strategies, particularly for those small businesses, micro businesses. We looked at behaviour change. There was a perception that systems change for the sector would require a real shift in mindset and culture. So moving away from one that's driven on a focus on the bottom line and competitive working to one that's focused on more long-term resilience and shifting towards that collaborative partnership model. We also needed a shift in attitudes towards products and materials, so moving more towards product stewardship and taking good care of materials, particularly in that catering equipment space. We also saw that standardized data collection practices are missing, meaning that baseline data on current material flows, products in use and waste, so right across that value chain, were missing, sometimes out of date. And this meant that it was difficult to establish the true scope and scale of material inflow for the sector. And access to infrastructure, which I've touched on already, in terms of storage space, was lacking, and access to facilities like anaerobic digesters to capture the value of food waste was also maybe a little bit patchy. So how do we overcome these challenges? The way that we approach this is through 4 key building blocks. So the first is design, and for this sector, design for circularity needs to be embedded across the activities. So right from the redesign of things like spaces during refurbishment activities, using ideas like designing in flexibility, maybe a more timeless style to avoid refurbishment space just on fashion and trends. Focusing on longevity, ease of removal, so that you can capture the value of difficult products like tiles or bathrooms when they're being removed, so they can be reused elsewhere, through to things like the redesign of menus in a way that supports local farmers with seasonal produce, perhaps by purchasing excess or surplus produce. When we're thinking about reverse logistics, this is really around increasing collaboration between manufacturers, suppliers, end users, and enabling those products and containers to be reused, valuable products to be captured, maybe refurbished, remanufactured. So for the hospitality sector, creating infrastructure which supports this is really key, whether that's through providing space for items to be stored or coordinating logistics. And these were things that came up when we did kind of future visioning with our workshop participants. So where they envisaged the future of the circular economy for the hospitality, these were things that came up in that. And you can have a look in the report in the appendices if you'd like to see more about that. New business models, back to the last slide, please, Alex, such as product as a service could support things like refurbishment activities, materials cycled between sites, or the provision of key equipment such as electronics and catering equipment through a product as a service model to help capture the value of that across the lifespan instead of them being retired early. And our case studies demonstrated the need for new collaborative partnerships with multiple organisations. So that's that partnerships piece coming up again. And then finally, the development of enabling conditions is really key for this sector, partly due to its makeup of so many SMEs and micro businesses. There's no overarching procurement framework, so everybody needs to come together, and there's a real need for leadership to create that shared vision and actionable roadmap, which engage multiple stakeholders in the transition. And we'll just take a look now at how we accelerate change. So these are the stakeholder groups that we identified, these key groups that can help accelerate the adoption of circular economy. So we see regulators, policymakers and trade bodies as our change catalysts. So they provide a clear vision and bring stakeholders together. Manufacturers and supply chain actors are our innovators. They redesign products, they offer new business models, and they're really key in supporting putting in place those building blocks of a circular economy. So enabling reuse, remanufacture, refurbishment, for example. The hospitality sector and their customers as well are our pioneers. So they signal the demand for change. They're innovative, they try new processes, and really importantly, they share learning along the way. Our third-party organisations and investors are our accelerators. So they enable strategies such as reuse and repair and refurbishment as well. And then finally, our academics and research partners are there to provide cross-sector insights, frameworks, and also to share wider learning on topics such as behaviour change, which is a really difficult piece to sort of embed in action plans and roadmaps. So what are the next steps? What we've seen so far are some really promising case studies, but what the baseline success criteria shows us is that the hospitality sector is not yet embedding circular economy across its activities as a kind of business as usual approach. So in order to move forward, we need some clear leadership, we need collaborative action, and our stakeholders created a range of different visions for circular economy in the hospitality sector. We need to start to initiate pilots of schemes such as these so that we can establish their impact and their viability. We need robust data collection systems to support all of this, to fill in the gaps in the baseline data and to give us a clear picture of the material flows across the hospitality sector. So that's going beyond food and plastics. And finally, we need to develop an actionable roadmap, which engages all of those key groups, are what I've been calling our stakeholder groups, to enable implementation at scale. So that was a real whistle-stop tour of the report. There's lots more detail in there, so please do download it, have a look. If you've got any questions and you want to come back to me after the session, after you've had a chance to really look through the report, I'll pop my email address in the chat. I was happy to talk to you. And the other thing that we've been working on in collaboration with St Austell, who are going to talk next, is a refurbishment guide. So if you are thinking about carrying out a refurbishment activity and you're keen to know how you might be able to embed circular principles in that, I'll pop the link in the chat for that, and there's a link in the report as well. So you'll be able to access that. Thank you very much. That's all from me. I'm really pleased to be able to invite Caroline to the call today. Caroline and I have been working together over the last year on the exciting circular refurbishment for the Pier House project. It's been really interesting. I'm talking about sharing learning. Caroline, I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Danny. Again, yeah, it's really great to be part of kind of having these conversations, because I think for us especially, you know, we're a family-owned brewery in the southwest. We are quite a traditional business, so actually, whilst we have a lot of progress in things like our brewing, we invest a lot of money every year within the business from a kind of capital perspective. A lot of that is within our refurbishments of our pubs. So we have 44 managed pubs that we own and run ourselves. We have loads of tenancies beyond that. So actually it was a really great opportunity to kind of dive into how we approach those projects. And Danny and the team have been brilliant in kind of guiding us along the way. As a lot of us, especially me, I kind of lead the way on some of the design for our projects. It's been fascinating and really insightful to kind of just challenge the status quo on a lot of how we've done stuff. And I think it's brought out quite a lot of learnings from that, a lot of which are outlined in the kind of paper that Danny's described. But I think some of them I've kind of outlined in one slide further on, Alex, if you're able to click on. And really a lot of that is about us as reasonably new to the circular economy from my perspective, and also as a business. I think we know a lot about carbon, we know a lot about sustainability, and when we sort of opened up the discussion internally, it kind of identified the fact that maybe we didn't know as much as we'd hoped, or actually when we started asking questions about what we were doing, did we know enough beyond a really superficial level? Like, we had conversations about a more circular approach, and some of the things that came out where we use reclaimed wood for things, or we'll do this and we recycle. And actually I think a lot of the the value was in sort of challenging those opinions within the business, and that really meant that we needed to arm, and me especially, arm myself with a bit more knowledge about what that meant, or where we've assumed that we're doing good things, actually is it the right thing, or is it the best thing for us? And often a lot of that challenge about what we do is married up with the commercials of it, and actually is it viable, you know, does it make good business sense? And more often than not, there was again, maybe it was just me sort of banging the drum but the kind of response was, well, it's the right thing to do, it's sort of our obligation to do it. But I think that required a bit more in-depth knowledge of what was appropriate, or where we could kind of make those gains. And actually that goes kind of beyond our business. It meant that we really needed to engage with our suppliers, our contractors. A lot of our refurbishments, you know, we spend £10 million a year on refurbishments across the business, and that can be anything from you know, a big £5 million entire strip out and refurbishment to much smaller £200,000, £100,000 refurbishments of existing pubs. So the case study that Danny and the team used and kind of guided us on was the Pier House, which is detailed in the paper, but essentially we had a massive fire back in 2022. It's a listed building in a UNESCO World Heritage Site down in Charlestown. It's in a beautiful harbour that is, you know, it's untouched. It's very sacred to the community. The building is equally so, and this fire kind of ripped out the back half of the building. Luckily, I mean, it no one was hurt. It ripped out the unlisted part of the building, so in a way it meant that everything that we did moving forwards was a bit easier. But actually it brought to life a lot of challenges about how we try and be more circular within historic and listed buildings specifically, and that brought up quite a lot of challenges when we spoke to our heritage consultants, who are so well versed in heritage buildings and working with conservation officers and the conservation team. Actually that brought up a lot of challenges in terms of what materials we could use, what they were willing to do or what they weren't willing to do, because they obviously have the building's best interests at heart in terms of retaining that heritage element. And you know, that came down to things like when we talked about wastewater, we talked about trying to get grey water, using the grey water from the roofs, but actually the challenge was that wouldn't necessarily go down very well on a listed building. So we had to kind of find a balance that meant we were doing as much as we could do to be doing our best, but acknowledging where for certain buildings that wasn't necessarily either appropriate or possible, and actually focusing our attentions on other areas. So we kind of looked into a lot of things like the specific construction materials where we could make gains, whether we were changing out insulation, and again this kind of recurring theme of some resistance and challenge from whether it was suppliers or contractors was around, well, that's not the way that we've done it before. What people wanting to use trusted products, and actually having to really engage and have really meaningful conversations with people sort of showed them that we weren't doing it to be difficult. We weren't doing it because, you know, we wanted to make some kind of big statement about what we were doing. Actually, it's just the right thing to do. And a lot of kind of product development has moved on so much that there's no reason to question some of these materials. That was even right down to putting a bit more pressure on our design teams that we would use externally. If we're talking about the use of tiles on a wall, kind of just asking and having really interesting conversations about why we're using tiles. Do we need to be tiling to full height? Can we be using different types of product? And actually, when you're coming from a place of reasonable naivety, but a willingness to learn and try and find the right outcome, that kind of collaboration was quite powerful, because actually it meant that for our suppliers or our designers that we use, they also were willing to try and find that information and sort of rethink some of the choices that we were making, which actually was really powerful, I think, in terms of how we approach things. And I think the biggest learning was, with the Peer House in mind, is that it was our first step on that journey. I think we'd between our sustainability team internally and me, it felt quite overwhelming to try and tackle all of these things all at once. And actually, it was trying to understand what the quick wins were, trying to understand what we were doing already that maybe we hadn't acknowledged that was really, really good, and that we were already essentially implementing some circular strategies, whether we were redistributing a lot of our furniture that we would take out of projects within our estate, whether we were refurbishing equipment within our estate, be it kitchen equipment, be it any other equipment within site, down to crockery, kitchen equipment, pots and pans. A lot of that we were doing because it was the right thing to do, and it was the kind of common sense approach. But actually putting that down onto paper meant that we knew that that was our sort of bare minimum of what we knew was appropriate. So actually building on that and finding the quick wins was really powerful for us. And actually kind of fostering those relationships with those suppliers and with our kitchen supplier or with our M&E contractors to try and make sure that we were doing the best from a circular perspective, but also not compromising on our guest experience, which is obviously paramount in hospitality. That a lot of it was about finding a balance and not feeling like we had to kind of reach this utopian world in one go, and actually it is an evolution. And I think one of the findings from that was that the best way for us to help ourselves move forward and not be so reliant on either my, albeit minimal, knowledge or anyone else's knowledge or willingness to do it, was to kind of create a bit of a design framework of how we approach those things. And again, a lot of that is all quite simple, straightforward approaches to how we reuse and redistribute things that have a a long life left in them, but they might not be appropriate for this particular project. So we started to, and now we're in the process of kind of building this framework essentially, and that kind of, we've split it down into all of these different sections, whether that's furniture, whether that's kind of our approach to lighting, our approach to water, electricity, where we're sourcing items from, making sure that we're kind of, if we can, designing for disassembly when we're talking about furniture, which are often the things that are going to be replenished more in a kind of high volume site. But we've started putting all of that down into a document that means that we can kind of use that as leverage with our suppliers and our contractors to say, this is our expectation from you. We want to work collaboratively with you, but this is a kind of non-negotiable. And that's been, I think, quite powerful, and has gained quite a lot of traction internally in terms of a desire to develop it and use it for its intended purpose. And I think that will become a kind of ever evolving document that we will keep feeding into, or as and when we have more knowledge to add in, or we change our expectations on certain elements, or we've learned that there's better ways of doing things or other practices that we can implement. It means that this kind of document is our non-negotiable framework that we will let evolve as we learn a bit more about our kind of journey towards circularity. So always happy to talk about it, because my knowledge is growing, but there's still a real way to go. And I think it's been a long journey, but I think one that we can see that we're making marginal gains. So it kind of gives you a bit more motivation to try with something else. So we know that this works, we'll try something else, or we'll feel like we need to maybe have a bit of a leap of faith, but actually that kind of collaborative feeling of we're doing the right thing and we're working towards the right kind of end goal has been pretty, I think, powerful in terms of how we have those conversations internally. So very grateful to Danny and the team for kind of helping us along that journey and giving us a bit of a boost and a bit of a confidence boost that we're doing the right thing, or actually where can we look for this, and those kind of guides have been paramount, I think, into just kind of changing the way that we approach stuff. So very grateful for that. Happy to talk to anyone that wants to talk about it, because I could talk all day long about it.
Thanks, Caroline. 10 minutes is never enough. And I think one of the things that you said there about perfection is striving for perfection can feel so overwhelming. And your message has been all the way along, oh, we're going to do what we can. And then next time we might do a little bit more. I think that's so important to hear. So thank you. I'd like to introduce Mark now, Mark Chadwick from Impact Loop. Welcome. Impact Loop provided us with one of our case studies and worked with us in the development of the report, looking at the opportunity for equipment, catering equipment specifically, for circular economy principles in hospitality. So Mark, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Danny. And thanks, Caroline. Super interesting. A lot of the things you're mentioning resonated a lot with what we're doing and how we're trying to get circular economy rolling. This idea of a non-negotiable framework, I think, is critical, because what we have found for sure is that by and large, manufacturers do not typically want to engage, don't want to provide data. They want to sell their equipment, and that's really their principal job. So how to get them to start to behave differently and to act differently. And really one of the principles we're following in Impact Loop is to work a lot with the end user of equipment, the ones who have the greenhouse gas targets and have the pressure to be more sustainable, and try to translate that pressure into incentives to act for the manufacturers. So that's very much one of the principles we're trying to follow. It was really interesting to see the 6 barriers, Danny, that you shared, because a lot of them are things that we're trying to address directly. This idea of there being no clear goal or alignment between circular economy and carbon targets, I think, is one of the big insights and changes that we implemented with Impact Loop. Some of you who are in this industry will maybe have heard of Loop Cycle before. So Loop Cycle is a business that I founded with Lugano Kapembwa probably in 2019. And really this founded on the basis of being a circular economy business. And we had this idea that, there was lots of materials flowing out there that could be used by others, but the matching of one party to the other was really troublesome. So we wanted to create a digital system to foster that matching. In the end, it was a very difficult value proposition to get companies to adopt, because there were not particularly strong targets from companies on circular economy. The drivers, the priorities were always on carbon and greenhouse gas and other sustainability measures. So one of the key things when we launched Impact Loop, which essentially replaced and acquired the assets of Loop Cycle, is we reframed things more as a greenhouse gas measurement topic, because we knew that was something that people would already had targets for and already were interested in. So in effect, greenhouse gases and sustainability are the Trojan horse that allow us to introduce circularity. So circularity is obviously a way that people can increase efficiency, reduce greenhouse gases, actually can save money very often. But in and of itself, we didn't find it a motivating factor enough in companies to drive change. So here we have this idea that we're tackling Scope 3 reductions. Thanks for moving the slide, Alex. So asset by asset, so gathering data and acting to reduce. There's a lot of complexity in what we're doing, and it's a business model innovation that we've created more than it's a complicated technical platform. It's this idea that if we can create a consistency of method and of measurement between lots of assets of different types, we can enable buyers of those assets to make smart choices, both about the cost of running the asset through its life, and this whole life costing part, I think, is a critical element of what we're trying to do here, but also the embodied emissions and the materials that are used in its construction. And then finally, when we start thinking about reaching the end of the useful life for an asset, how can we then make that asset, the awareness of the materials in that asset, the value in that asset, more obvious to other people so that they can take sensible actions at end of life. So that's really a bit the way we're seeing things philosophically. We know that lots of companies are asking their suppliers to engage in greenhouse gas reductions, to engage in circularity, and often they are not getting the responses that they want. So we're spending our time thinking about why is that actually? Normally, if your customer asks you to do something, it's in your interest as a supplier to them to, in fact, do the thing they're asking you to do, but it's not happening. So why not? So we have this idea that on the one hand, the incentives to act are not strong enough. So not many people, Caroline, have a non-negotiable framework. Most people say, can you give me the data, please? And then they won't get the data, but they will still buy the product anyway. So where's my incentive to act in fact? It's limited. And then the other point is the barriers are really high. So if I say to a manufacturer, please tell me the embodied emissions and life cycle inventory of this particular product, what do? So I go to a consultant and I pay them tens of thousands of pounds, and they go and spend 3 to 6 months or even longer doing a life cycle inventory for the product. I get this result back. And then what? I expected to do that for all 1,000 product lines that I have. I can't do it, right? So what we're really trying to do here is increase incentives, reduce barriers. How are we doing that? We can talk a bit about some case studies, but the key thing for us is we're trying to acquire a lot of data that nobody currently has. And once we have that data, our firm intention is to start to use machine learning, AI, to start to generate insights. Those insights could be all kinds of things. They could be, did you know, manufacturer, that you're using disproportionately more of material X or Y in your manufacture, and if you were able to change it, you would reduce your greenhouse gases. Could be something like that. Could be, did you know that as an operator of kitchen equipment, companies who own these particular types of devices use them in this way, and they use less energy than you do. So something targeted at end users. It could be from an end of life perspective. You know, we know that 30 tons of stainless steel is going to become available soon through the end of life recovery of certain assets, and then beginning to connect with people who might be able to use that. So there's all kinds of ways that we can mine that data once we acquire it. The problem everybody's had is getting the data in the first place, right? So that's a bit about what we're at. So if we just skip on to the next slide, Alex. So how does it work in practice? Every asset that we track in the platform will have its own unique identifier, and this can be attached by a QR code, either a physical one or a virtual one. Once we have this, we are able to calculate embodied carbon emissions and operational carbon emissions. So we have a way of doing this in a very low cost way for manufacturers, really just a few £100 instead of tens of thousands, and takes, you know, minutes to actually do rather than than months. Once we have that data, then we can start to mine it and generate those different options for people. And I'll share with you a few case studies of what tangibly this can actually do. The platform gives data back to the end users and to the manufacturers, which then allows a bit to bridge the gap between circularity and greenhouse gas accounting. So all of a sudden I can start to say, well, this is how much carbon I've saved through the actions that I've taken, which then creates another incentive for action. And really that's the sort of core of what we're trying to do here, is creating incentive to action and making it easy. So if we just go to the next slide, I'll just talk you quickly through a few of the concrete things that we're already seeing here. So when we're thinking about actions that you can take, we tend to think about 3 different buckets of action. So from a user perspective, buying better, using better, disposing better, right? Some of the things that we can see when we look at procurement, and when we're able to bring whole life costing and carbon and financial into the picture, is people will make different decisions. So in one study or one project that we've run, you're able to almost halve the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in the products that you buy just by understanding where the emissions are and making better choices. I mean, if we think about that, you know, with the heavy and strenuous greenhouse gas reduction targets companies have, with Scope 3 reduction targets being as strong often as Scope 1 and 2, and yet you don't have any way to act. So if we think about this, the ability to reduce by half my purchased goods and services just by having better data and choosing, it's huge, right? From a cost saving perspective, we had one particular case where we were looking at a replacement of a particular type of kitchen equipment. The default position was to replace the one you had with the one that you with the same model. So we did some optioneering and found that actually a model with very similar performance characteristics had fundamentally different energy use characteristics. And if this company was able to make that choice for the other product instead of the one they had before, they would save almost £1 million per year in the operation of that asset. So there's one asset type. That's it. And at the moment, I mean, the thing that blew my mind when I started to get deeper into this subject is there is no way for you as a buyer of equipment to know what the energy use characteristics of that equipment actually is. So you don't make a choice on the basis of what it's going to cost you to run because you just don't know. And so we're trying to solve that problem by giving people that awareness. The in-use stage is super interesting because, you know, we see that avoidable call-outs. So this one case study is about removing avoidable call-outs. So where somebody makes a maintenance request when actually it's a settings or a user or operational problem, we're talking about millions of pounds that are spent on call-outs that don't need to be made in the first place. So it's using the information we have available to us by giving machine learning driven insights to somebody who's about to raise a call-out, we can avoid many of them. You know, that saves an awful lot of carbon and an awful lot of money. And then the end of life piece is also super interesting because what we're seeing is there's a default behavior to say this stuff is coming out of my existing kitchen, it's going to be replaced, I'm just going to put it into the waste stream. What we see is there's so much value locked up in this stuff. So by and large, if, you know, let's say I'm a fast food company, I'm going to have essentially the same equipment in all of my stores. And I need to do that for repeatability. And so I keep everything, you know, I go to one branch, I go to another, the experience is the same, right? So what does that mean in practice? It means that when I take out the equipment from one place, all of those spare parts that are still serviceable and still useful are applicable in all of my other stores. So instead of sending it into the waste stream, we captured a bunch of equipment, we harvested the serviceable parts, and what we saw there is not only a big greenhouse gas reduction, but somewhere around 100% return on investment. So by avoiding spending on new parts, you actually save an absolute ton of money. But even better than that was where the equipment that came out was still in good condition, and it could be refurbished and reused as a complete piece of equipment. The IRR in this case was 200%. So by spending a bit of money refurbing a piece and making it serviceable again and putting it back in, the returns are fantastic. So this really is an opportunity for us to keep equipment going around and around and around in the circle. What we haven't yet been able to work out is the harvesting of the raw materials and the reuse of raw materials. So that's something that we very much have in mind. And when we're building our inventory of greenhouse gases in the first place, we're asking people for materials breakdown. So what this means is, in fact, we know how much copper we have, how much steel we have, how much iron we have, how much plastics we have, actually in the ecosystem of assets that we're tracking. And really, that's the next frontier for us, really, to then start to say, once you can no longer use it anymore, what cool recoverable stuff do we have and where is it and how do we get it? So hopefully that's a bit useful, and I'll stop there and we can see if any questions are there.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Mark. That's so interesting, the work that you're doing and tracking some of that data and filling in those gaps. It's going to be fantastic. I'm going to hand over to Ryan, who's going to lead us in our Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. And yeah, thanks to all the speakers. Super fascinating. I think, you know, my very small part in supporting Danny on the hospitality project just showed me how diverse the sector is and sort of all encompassing. So massive opportunities for embedding circularity. And I like the idea of circular economy as a Trojan horse. That was good. So questions, please, in the chat. We have about 10 minutes. This is a lunchtime webinar, so we'll stick to the 1 o'clock deadline. And we have one in the chat. So, hi, I have a question. Oh, before I read this one out, please, if you want to read your own question out, feel free to raise your hand and I'll come to you. So this is from Chiara. A question for Caroline. Have you received any government support, maybe in the form of local councils, on this circular economy journey? And if not, do you think it would have been beneficial?
I think, I mean, yeah, it's always beneficial, isn't it? Even from a kind of community perspective, everything that we do, pubs by nature are so embedded in the community, and actually getting that community support is always brilliant. I think probably there's, for that particular project, I think we needed to be a bit surer in what our aims were, goals were, to know what support we needed, and then essentially could approach and say, hey, we're doing this, can you support us? You know, a lot of the projects that we tend to do have quite a lot of spotlight on them because they're, you know, at the heart of every community, whether that's the local community wanting to know what's happening. We, I think, did a lot of it ourselves. We approached a company to help redistribute a lot of our unused equipment, fixtures and fittings to not-for-profits within the local area. So I think if we can get more support for anything that's to do with the kind of social impact, even if it's on that level, is always appreciated. But we didn't for that one particularly.
Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, just to be upfront, the Pier House is also my local pub. So a question for Mark, yeah, and it's fantastic. Question for Mark. What time resource is needed to input the equipment initially into the system, considering a large organization might have several tens of thousands of individual items to add into the platform? How could that be done effectively?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one of the things that is most important to us to try to keep these barriers low. Right now, we are primarily ingesting data via spreadsheets or CSVs. So in fact, we can get that data from all kinds of other systems. So long as we can get the items that we need from those other systems that you're, I think, Sean, you're thinking about, we can ingest it. So when we're thinking about data extraction, we have to be super flexible, right? And that's really one of the key things we have in our mind. What we're looking for when we're trying to build these greenhouse gas inventories is relatively basic information. So that's really one of the innovations that we've come up with that makes us different from traditional life cycle inventories. What we look at for different asset classes is what are the material components that really drive an embodied carbon footprint, for example. Mostly, it's actually the materials that things are made out of. So what we really need from organizations is essentially stuff that you can extract out of your bill of materials. So the projects that we will typically be engaged in, we will be thinking about what ERP do you use as your organization? Where do you store your bill of materials? And how do we get that information and ingest it quite quickly? So that's really the process. So yeah, you're right. There might be tens of thousands of items. Individual items I don't think are particularly an issue, Sean, because the key thing is the models. So if you've got 10,000 of the exact same piece of equipment, the embodied carbon footprint by and large will be about the same. The differences will be there. Maybe you've got, pubs all around the country, so the transportation from one place to another might be slightly different, but by and large, they'll be the same. It's more about how many different model numbers or different types of products you're tracking that drives the complexity. That make sense?
Thanks, Mark. I think this is possibly a follow-up to what you're saying. As much of the clients from Adriana, as much of the client's supply chain comes from Asia, how do you manage this effectively?
Yeah, so it's the same basic issue. So we're boiling down to the absolute most material. And so when we're thinking about where material and components come from, that's how we capture the data. So we want to know if your item is made substantially out of stainless steel, where do you source that stainless steel from? If you have large components in your asset, actually, where do you source them from? So we're not getting into the level of detail where we would want to go and inventory a particular factory where you might be making something, because by and large, that doesn't make as much difference to the overall footprint. So, this is the level of abstraction, I think, is the key thing for us. And it's the bit of the business model innovation that we have that I mentioned earlier. Very happy to talk more about it, Adriana, if you want to get in touch with me. I think it's too deep to get into on this webinar with the time we have available.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, we do have a couple of minutes left for any additional questions. If anybody wants to pop another one in the chat or raise their hands. I'll ask one to Danny then, while we have a little bit of time. Oh, I thought that another one came in, but yeah, no. So Yeah, Danny, it was, I was on the sideline seeing you do this work, and I was just wondering about the kind of systems perspective for the sector, because from what I saw, it's very diverse and, bits and pieces everywhere. So I was wondering how, from your perspective, the ability to approach it as from a systemic perspective, or not, I'd be interested to just hear a few thoughts on that.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, so when we looked at bringing everybody together, we saw a mixed sector, lots of different businesses. For embedding circular economy into that, we really wanted to bring in our hospitality people, but also supply chains and policymakers, because everybody's got a role to share in the journey. And so that was one aspect, and I was very grateful to everyone who engaged with that. We had a really strong interest from the outset in circular economy on what that could do for us. And then the other side of that was to make sure that in amongst the kind of technical, here's the data, here's the infrastructure, what technology do we need, what innovation do we need, we brought in that behaviour change piece. So thinking about the social impact of change. And so we ran the workshops from that perspective, and everybody who came along had to think about each activity from both a behaviour change, social impact perspective and a technical perspective, so that as you'll see if you look at the report, the roadmap takes into account all of those things, so that we can understand if we create a new innovation over here, does it meet the needs of the people? Have we got the skills that we need to implement it, and bring together all of those things? And so in response to your question, yes, I think that was a great way to approach it. And we drew out some really nuanced, interesting issues that kind of maybe wouldn't have come up without that people and social impact approach. What I think perhaps needs to happen next, which isn't what you asked, but I'm going to answer it anyway, is to take that and to look at, okay, how do we change behaviour, and to do a really practical piece on, we've identified all of these issues, how do we move people from A to B to C along this journey? How do we bring everybody with us?
Thanks. That's very interesting. Oki has come in for the very final question, hopefully a succinct one. Thanks, Oki.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you very much for the presentation, guys. Thank you, Mark, for your presentation. I just have a question. Maybe I missed it, but it's on the data that which you worked on. I was wondering, did you use any data from the ONS database?
For which
ONS
database, sorry?
Do you use any? Did you access any data from the ONS database?
No, we don't. We're getting primary data from manufacturers. That's our main intention, because we want to understand from the people who are building the product, what are its, how is it constructed, out of what is it made, and what are its in use energy use characteristics. Yeah, so we're collecting primary data.
And then the with respect to the emissions, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions, how did you identify these emissions to be scope 3? Was it from the manufacturers themselves?
So, well, there's a lot of double counting around scopes, for sure, right? Yeah. So, the manufacturing emissions associated for the manufacturer will be both scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 for the manufacturer. Yeah. There will be scope 3 for the end user when they buy it, but there will be scope 1 and 2 for the end user when they run it, and there will be scope 3 for the end user when they dispose of it. So I think it's it doesn't fit super neatly into any one of the particular scopes, because it all depends from whose perspective you're looking. So we're not really a greenhouse gas accounting platform. It's not our intention to calculate scope 1 and 2, 3 emissions. It's our intention to calculate asset emissions. And then other people can allocate those into scope 1, 2, and 3 based on the vantage point that they're looking from. So what you should imagine for us is, for every asset that sits in our platform, it has a passport. And that passport says, where did it come from? What were its emissions when it was built? What's happened to it since? So where was it transported from and to? If it has a second life, like it comes from St. Austell and it ends up in charity somewhere, we want to track that too. So we want to know that, you go to a charity, You sit there at a table, you scan its QR code, and you see, hey, wow, this used to be in the in the St Austell pub around the corner from me. I didn't know that. That was great. And you can see all of that stuff. So that's the idea.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, I'm going to have to jump in now. Talking about QR codes, Alex, could we have the next slide, please, if possible? So that's all that's left really is to thank all the speakers. You know, super interesting. I think everybody's open to being contacted after this, and we can certainly sort of pass messages around if that would be helpful. Coming soon, so just next week, we have the third of our sector reports coming live, and an associated webinar. If you scan the QR code on the screen, it will take you to the Eventbrite page, so you can sign up to join that one, so don't miss that. And there's a final slide, which will take you to a very short survey run by the Exeter Centre for Circular Economy. So the CE Hub is based at Exeter Business School, and we're sort of transitioning, I suppose, as NICER comes to an end, to the Exeter Centre for Circular Economy. So if you've had anything to do with the CE Hub and wish to share your views, we'd be very grateful to receive them. And thank you very much, everybody. It's 1 o'clock, so a successful webinar. Thanks again to the speakers.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.
Thank you, everyone.